Hi guys, I'm Dr. Stefanie K. Johnson coming to your basement from my basement. Just kidding, I don't know where you are, but I am in my basement giving a talk here about something that I'm super passionate about for United. And the topic is diversity and inclusion. And it may seem like in this crazy time of COVID-19 that maybe diversity and inclusion isn't top of mind, but I'm going to argue that in fact it should be, because it's even more challenging than normal to bring people together when you're all physically apart and socially distanced. And so I want to share some data on why diversity and inclusion is so important, and then provide leaders with some strategies for creating a more inclusive work environment during this very crazy COVID-19 time. So thank you for letting me into your home to give this talk. I am a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm going to share my screen here so you can watch a little PowerPoint while also while I'm talking. Most of the stuff that I'm going to cover in this talk is based on my forthcoming book, Inclusify, Harnessing the Power of Uniqueness and Belonging to Build Innovative Teams. The book is on sale everywhere, June 2nd. You can get it from harpercollins.com or anywhere that books are sold. And but hopefully some of this stuff will be useful for you as I talk about it here today. So let me just start out by talking about why diversity is so important. So there's a ton of data out there over the last, I'd say like 4 or 5 years, showing the immense power of diversity to improve the bottom line. So one study showed that for every 1% increase in gender diversity or 1% increase in racial diversity, that the company experienced a 3 and 9% sales boost, respectively. So the benefit for racial diversity was a bit higher than gender diversity, and I think that's because we have a lot more work in this area to do. Another study showed that more diverse companies that had greater diversity and inclusion programs and thought about diversity in a really diverse way to make sure that everyone was included, on average created 2 more new products per year. And I mean, to me, that's phenomenal. It really shows you the innovation potential of having a diverse organization. We also know that you're 158% times more likely to capture a new market, a new target market for your product, if someone from that target market is represented on the team, because they have that understanding of a different customer base. And finally, we know that companies with more women on their corporate board have 36.4 times higher stock returns. So this is good. So you shouldn't just have diversity in your company. You should also make sure that you have diversity on your board. And then you should invest in companies if you are a stock investor with greater diversity. But it's not just diversity that matters. And this is really where my research has gone over the last few years, because what we find is that even the most diverse company doesn't experience all of these benefits unless they also have inclusion. So we see some organizations, they're super diverse and they report, well, we have greater conflict in our organization now. We have higher turnover in our organization now. And we heard these great benefits were going to come from diversity, but we're not seeing it. And the reason is that diversity does not bring the same benefits to your organization if you don't also have inclusion. And that means that everyone in the organization feels like they can contribute their ideas and their unique perspective is valued. So this is just from one study from Burson. They found that companies that had greater inclusion had 2.3 times higher cash flow. This was over a 3-year period. They found that more inclusive companies were 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders and change ready, which I'll talk about later is so important right now when we're trying to deal with so much change and need for innovation in companies. They also found that more inclusive companies were 3.8 times more likely to be able to improve employees' performance through coaching. So those employees are more receptive to developing, and that they are 2.9 times more likely to identify and build leaders in their organization. So it's a lot of really fantastic outcomes for having both diversity and inclusion. But how do you build inclusion when you're all working apart? And in some of my work, I have worked really closely with chief diversity officers of some major corporations across the globe. And what I'm finding right now is these chief diversity officers talk about really fighting to remain relevant. As the company is like, our stock price is plummeting, we have to do layoffs, we need to move all of our work to be remote. These are immense challenges, and D&I is really fighting to remain relevant, is what they say. And they're really fearful that all the work they've done, say over the last 5 years, where organizations have invested a ton in diversity and inclusion, they're fearful that all that work is going to be undone and that we're going to go back to 2005 in terms of our diversity and inclusion outcomes. And so if you think of things like layoffs, you could undo all the diversity you brought in by just disproportionately laying off one group or another. And there's reasons why it's important for leaders to recognize the role of diversity when it comes to COVID-19. And I'll just give you a few reasons that maybe you haven't really thought about. So in the US, we found that people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So if you look at hospitalizations and deaths, people of color are more represented in both of those groups, over much more so than they are represented in the population. I think of parents as a group that has been disproportionately impacted by COVID, as I have 2 little kiddos who are upstairs. You may be able to hear them yelling right now. But having children means that you have a somewhat different work environment when you come to work at home. You might get Zoom bombed any second. And it's just sometimes a little bit harder to get things done while you're also homeschooling your children. And so I think that's something that's really important for leaders to recognize. Another thing that really stands out to me is that this is a very stressful time and can be a very lonely time for a lot of people. Maybe those people who don't have kids running around their house screaming in the background, they may have more time, but they may also be more lonely. And what I haven't heard organizations talking about is just the importance of mental health in this time. And similarly, disabilities. So if you have to move all your work from home, you may not have the same accessibility options available that you had in the workplace. And these things have huge implications for organizations. In the US, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and most disabilities are actually mental disabilities like anxiety and depression. And if we're not recognizing those, we're actually not doing our leadership duty to ensure that persons with disabilities and mental illness have what they need to succeed. And then finally, access to the internet. So like the fact that I can do this and stream it and record it is really tied to wealth. And having this space, like this is my basement, and some people don't have that luxury of having a quiet space or even having reliable internet, or they might have their kids on the internet too doing their courses and they may run out of bandwidth. And so that's something that leaders really need to think about. There's a lot of other things I'm sure you can imagine, other reasons why diversity and inclusion is more important right now. And these might be different depending on what country you're in or the different conditions that exist, but there's endless numbers. And I want you to just think for a second and maybe jot a few down, maybe the ones that I mentioned or maybe others, about maybe some issues that you might want to bring up around diversity in this time of COVID. I won't pause for too long, but you can pause me if you want. So to me, the answer to deal with these most pressing issues is inclusive leadership. If you are already an inclusive leader and we're already doing a great job, then these issues actually would have already been all resolved. You would have talked to your employees about them. But all of us, and most of us, are on a journey to be inclusive leaders. And we're not our most perfect inclusive selves at all times. But we can do better. So we can start by just addressing race and gender and other disparities with our team. We can talk about these issues. You can say, I watched this United talk and I heard that, you know, maybe there's some people are experiencing COVID differently than I am, and I want to hear about that. And then providing empathy and understanding for people's differences. Because if someone does have low access to internet or childcare demands, as a leader, it's really important that those people feel supported and not threatened by the fact that they're experiencing tougher times. Another point is that having innovation is actually going to ensure that those creative and innovative ideas come out. Having greater inclusion brings out greater creativity. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And it's important that leaders just start doing a better job with equity and not just thinking about equality or treating everyone equally, like I'm going to give everyone the same thing. That just doesn't work when people are experiencing the world in very different ways. And so thinking about equity and giving people what they need rather than just giving everyone the same. So why is this happening? So, you know, I wrote this article a couple years ago about a parasite, Toxoplasma gondii. You get it from cats, and when humans get it, it changes their behavior in strange ways. It might make you more likely to be in a car accident, more likely to have road rage, to engage in really risky behaviors. And in my study, we found that Toxoplasma gondii was also linked to entrepreneurship. It changed the way people behaved. But in fact, disease actually changes people's behavior who don't even have the disease. And the idea is called the behavioral immune system. And the idea is that over evolutionary time, humans have adapted and their behavior changes when there's a large threat of disease. And so maybe the most obvious example of this that people talk about is disgust. The disgust reaction, when you're like, oh, is actually heightened when there's a strong disease threat. So like when a flu's going around or cold's going around, things will feel more disgusting to you. So if I licked my hand right now, it should be very disgusting, right? I didn't really lick it, I swear. And the idea is that that adaptation is keeping you as a human from getting that disease. Because if you're more disgusted by things, you're less likely to eat the novel food or interact with the novel person and less likely to catch a disease. Why is this relevant here? Research has also shown very consistently that when disease threat is high, people are also more biased and racist against people who have different skin color than themselves. And so in the US and across the globe, we find that states that have higher disease risk actually have greater bias against people of color. And across the globe, this is the same thing that we find, that countries that have higher disease threat, there's more disease that's common, tend to have greater racism in that country. And interestingly, that the disease threat is higher disease threat in the past is what predicts present day racism. So there's kind of a causal implication there. But it's not just people of different races. What the research shows is that your desire to avoid disease also makes you avoid anyone who might look like their disease. So that could be if someone has different skin color, you don't know what's causing that, so you might stay away from them. But it's also older individuals. They might appear subconsciously or evolutionary to have disease. They're moving slowly. Persons with disabilities, people who are overweight, anyone with a facial disfigurement, you would feel like you don't want to be around them. Another super interesting implication of disease threat is it makes people more likely to conform to the group. And if you think about the disgust mechanism that I talked about earlier, when disease threat is high, you don't want to be the first person to try the red berry, right? You want to make sure if everyone else does it and they survive, then you're okay to do it. But you're more likely to look to the group to see how to behave. And that's problematic because this is a time when we need creativity and innovation, not conformity the most. So a little more on that and how we can get around this disease threat issue. So a long time ago in the 1950s, a psychologist, Solomon Asch, did a research study on conformity. And many of you have probably seen this study before. But what he did is brought 3 Confederates, so people who were in on the study, into a laboratory, and 1 participant who didn't know what was going on, right? They're the real participant. And he asked a simple question, and that is, which line, A, B, or C, is the same length as line X? And this is a very simple question. If you can't tell, just like lean in really close to the screen, and the answer should be A. But imagine that these 3 other people in the room answer first, and the first person who's in on the study answers C. You would probably snicker, think like, what? That guy, he can't see very well, or he's didn't get the question, but you think he's wrong. And then the second person answers, and he answers C. And now you're starting to wonder, wait, what was the question? And you ask the third guy, like, wait, what are we supposed to do here? And the guy ignores you. He says, C. And now it's your turn to answer. And what Solomon Asch found in the 1950s is that people would knowingly give the wrong answer to conform. And why this is important is in 2018, researchers redid this study and found a couple of really interesting things. One, you probably would not be surprised to know that conformity is way down overall. People are a lot less likely to conform in 2018 than they were in the 1950s. But what they did is also create a condition where the 3 Confederates were racially diverse. And that's important because what they found is that when those Confederates were racially diverse or different from the person who was a participant, that participant was even less likely to conform. And the researchers concluded that essentially diversity stops conformity, because when someone's different from you, then you're less likely to just go along with their answer because you already see them as different. And so conforming to difference just doesn't make as much sense as conforming to people who are similar to you. And so I would say when we have disease threat, we might be experiencing this unconscious need to stay away from people who are different from us. But in fact, being around people who are different might solve the other issue of it makes us less likely to conform. Okay, so here is the challenge. How do we make people feel included when we're all apart? And how can you foster innovation when we all just want to conform? The answer to me is to Inclusify, and that is to recognize the 2 most essential human needs and to ensure that as a leader, you're giving those to your followers. So the first most essential human need is to be unique. You want to be seen and valued for your unique perspective. And that means like people want to know what you're thinking. People recognize the fact that you are, say, a woman or a person of color. They're not pretending they don't see race or gender, but they see the fact that you are who you are, and they value that difference. And if you don't believe this is one of the most essential human needs, think about a time in your past where you've had to cover in some way. You couldn't really be yourself. Maybe you had a very unpopular opinion at a Thanksgiving dinner table, or you had to like bite your tongue because you thought that people in the workplace wouldn't agree with your thoughts. And that feels bad, right? You don't really want to experience that. Second is the desire to belong, to be accepted as an integral, important, essential member of your team. And that, if you don't believe that, just think of a time when you've experienced the opposite of that, or exclusion. Probably everyone has a school experience where they felt left out, or even a workplace experience where they felt like they didn't belong. And that feels really bad. And so when you put those 2 things together, you have this desire to be unique, but also to be accepted for who you are. If you are accepted, but only when you're covering, it's just really not the same thing. So here's a little uniqueness versus belonging quiz. Okay, so which is it? If a leader says that they don't see race or they're gender blind, Is that taking away someone's uniqueness or belonging? Uniqueness. If you're not sharing information about important decisions, does that make people feel less unique or like they don't belong? It's belonging. If you fail to exhibit trust and allow employees to have autonomy, is that uniqueness? You're lacking uniqueness or belonging? That's belonging. Calling a woman of color by another woman of color's name. That's right, that's uniqueness. It's saying, I don't even see you as an individual. I only see you as a woman of color and you're all interchangeable. Ignoring different views during meetings is a lack of uniqueness. You're not allowing people to provide their distinct impressions or viewpoints. Giving one race or gender group more busy work, less kind of promotable, important tasks, is also uniqueness. So it's telling people that you actually don't value their contribution as much as you value another group's contribution. Creating conflict around diversity efforts. This is one of the things I talked about earlier. Diversity and inclusion efforts can also cause people to feel left out or excluded, and that is belonging. And then organizing events that exclude some people is a lack of belonging. So why did I mention these things? Really, because if you can start to see how uniqueness and belonging is elicited or how it's taken away, you can find ways to make your organization more inclusive or your team. So I'm going to give you a second. Again, you can pause me. But I want you to maybe take a couple notes on things that you've experienced that cause you to feel like your uniqueness is diminished, that people aren't valuing your distinct perspective. And then we'll do the same thing for belonging. So what it comes down to is this kind of 2x2 matrix of uniqueness and belonging. And you can imagine that uniqueness and belonging, there's like an inherent tension between these things. It's kind of easy to make sure everyone feels like they belong if everyone's the same. And in fact, some organizations have uniqueness is really paramount. But as a result, people don't feel cohesive. They don't feel like they all belong together. So doing both is very tricky, but I want to talk about the consequences of not doing uniqueness and belonging. So if you have no uniqueness, people don't recognize your different special talents, and you feel like you're not accepted, you don't have belonging, then those individuals in my research talked about really feeling invisible, that no one sees them, no one cares what they're experiencing or feeling or what their contributions might be. They're just invisible. And we often think of invisibility as something that workers, like shift workers, might experience. People who, work late at night that don't interact with a lot of other people feel invisible. Cleaning staff often feel invisible. You can imagine, I think of when I'm at school and people are cleaning, I think they're trying to stay out of your way. And by not acknowledging and saying, hello, how are you doing, to those people who feel invisible, you're just reinforcing that invisibility. And what's interesting is a lot of people of color and women of color also report feeling invisible, even when they're not in roles like janitorial roles or working a shift work. When they're professors and lawyers and doctors, they still feel invisible because people aren't recognizing the unique perspective they bring, and they're not bringing them in as part of the team. If you have more belonging, you feel like people accept you, but you're faking it, you're covering, you're not being who you really are, then you feel incomplete. Because if you can't be the real you, or sometimes people talk about bringing your whole self to work, then you never really feel included. You feel like they'll accept me if I act like the group. And I think, we see this a lot, and we think of covering as something that women often do. They might act more masculine or not talk about their kids, or people of color might do by, we say like acting white in the US, but it's more than that. A lot of people cover different areas of their lives. Maybe it's a disability that's unseen or some other stigma that you don't want to share with people, so you keep it inside. And when you do that, and when your employees do that, they'll never truly feel like part of the group. You need to know who they really are. If you feel unaccepted, but you are just truly you in every way, then you feel kind of insular. So even though you're ensuring that everyone hears your unique perspective all the time and everyone understands what you're about, if you're not accepted, then you actually feel quite alone, right? You're isolated. And that's not a good feeling. And what we see in all of these cases when people feel incomplete, insular, or invisible, they are less likely to want to share their views, and they're more likely to want to leave the organization. They want to quit and find an organization where they can be seen and be complete and accepted. So the goal is really to bring both of these things together, of uniqueness and belonging, so that every employee feels valued for who they are, and that is inclusion. That's the goal. So how do you achieve this? In Inclusify, I talk about 4 key behaviors that leaders need to do to enhance uniqueness, to make sure that everyone feels like they can be their unique selves. And then 4 behaviors that they can exhibit to build belonging. And these spell self and team, and so they're easy to remember. And I'm going to start with the uniqueness side. So the first thing that leaders can do is publicly support diversity. Rather than trying to be blind to difference, like I don't see difference, they recognize it and they embrace it as something they value. So I want you to think for a second. Again, you can pause me. What are leaders doing right now who publicly support diversity during this time? There should be a G there. What can you do as an individual to publicly support diversity and inclusion? Then the E in self is empathy. Inclusifiers really get to know their people so they can begin to understand their team members and where they're coming from. So how do you act when you really want to understand what someone's going through? And you think about this experience with COVID, there's probably individuals you talk to, friends or family, where you really want to know how they're experiencing or what they're feeling. And if you can apply that to your team and explain to them and demonstrate the empathy that you care and want to understand their experience, then you're more likely to be able to understand those differences and then support your team. The L in self is learn. Inclusifiers have a hunger to learn. They try to hire people with different opinions, and they try to bring out that difference, different perspectives during meetings. So what would you do if you really wanted to learn someone's perspective on a remote call? Imagine you're talking to the world's greatest authority on whatever it is you do in your business. How would you act? How would you try to elicit their opinion? And then I want you to think about how you would apply that with your team. If there's people in there, maybe you don't know which person, but one person has the answer to solve all your problems. How would you ensure that you bring that out? And then the F is fair. Inclusifiers give fairness through equality, but also equity, which is giving people what they really need to be successful. So the question for you, and you would know this if you demonstrated the empathy portion, is are there some individuals on your team who are being disproportionately affected by COVID? And if there are, can you be more fair? And what I mean by that is, can you support them in what they're experiencing rather than treating everyone equally? So those the self and team, self and now team. The T in team is transparent. And I feel like this is so important right now. Inclusifiers are aggressively transparent about their practices, and they understand how they appear to others. So I want you to think about what information you're sharing with your team, and if you can be more transparent. People are hungry for information. They want to know, are there going to be layoffs? Is their job secure? When are we going to come back to the office? What's going to happen? And as to the extent possible, I think leaders really need to be transparent, even if they don't have the answers. Like, here's the things we're considering. This being clear about this is a very difficult situation, and making sure that you're providing people the information that they need to feel like they're part of the group. The E in team is empower. I actually think this is quite easy to do right now, to empower rather than like micromanage your teams while they're working remotely. But inclusifiers or inclusive leaders empower team members to make their own decisions, conveying high expectations for success. So it's not like, I want you just to do your work however you want, because I don't really care. It's, I want you to do your work in the way that suits you right now, because I feel confident in your ability to do your work successfully on your own time, in your own way, or whatever it might be. So think about how you can empower your remote team members, and how to just make people overall feel like they have control over their work. Aligning. Inclusifiers actively promote interdependence among team members and align allies in the D&I conversation. So I mentioned giving people what they need and equity, and I think that's so important. But we can also see that that can bring out feelings of inequity by the group members who aren't getting benefits. So if you say, okay, you know, parents can do their work on their own time because they have kids at home, but non-parents have to be here face-to-face on Zoom all day. That actually might create inequity. So what I really suggest is thinking about how diversity might be divisive right now. And rather than telling people, hey, you're going to do extra work to help others, you bring them into the conversation to be part of the solution. So, you know, we see some of our team members are experiencing this or that. What do you want to do to help support them? And then people who don't want to do anything, they can choose not to. But those individuals who see the importance of helping out their coworkers can personally offer to give that assistance or to support their coworker. And then when it comes from them, it's going to actually build them up, make them feel happier rather than draining them and making them feel like, oh, great, now I have more work. And then last, the M in team is motivate. So inclusifiers motivate their teams by infusing diversity, inclusion, and belonging into the organization's values. They celebrate, they have parties, and they give recognition. They use their strong culture building skills to create a positive culture. So I want you to think for a second about how you're building culture during COVID-19. What are your COVID-19 rites and rituals? Are you doing happy hours? Are you watching Netflix together while you're apart? And can you make those more inclusive? So if it is happy hours, maybe all your events shouldn't revolve around alcohol, because some individuals who have different religious backgrounds, or people who might be alcoholics, or individuals who just don't drink, may not have fun in all the virtual happy hours. So maybe also having some virtual coffee hours. So here's the team: transparent, empower, align, and motivate. And in sum, I would encourage every leader to try to live and lead in a way that recognizes and celebrates unique and dissenting perspectives, while creating a collaborative and open-minded environment where everyone feels they can truly belong. And that's the definition of inclusifying. So I'm going to give you 5 steps to inclusify during COVID. Here's just my 5 suggestions. There's many more ideas that you could employ, but first, I'm going to say have a one-on-one video chat with each team member to learn about their situation. So that is a separate Zoom call or Skype or Teams or whatever you use, some kind of face-to-face medium, to just ask people how they're doing. And I say, remember the 10% time, and this is actually a very, very old study I did on remote teams, showed that teams that interacted face-to-face less than 10% of the time, so fewer than 4 hours a week, had way worse emotional outcomes for their team. They were less committed. And But teams, if you just could get over 10%, so that's 4 hours a week, and you can apply this during COVID in that you want to think about having about 4 hours a week of time where people are face-to-face over Zoom, like even if it's not really face-to-face, but they're interacting with a human and so they feel seen. 4 hours. And it doesn't have to be all 4 hours with you. It could be that you have smaller groups of people, but really trying to make sure that individuals aren't spending their entire week just alone in their basement. 2, design meetings so that you hear from each person in the chat room. So how do you do that? You can send questions in advance. You can have people take turns. If you have a meeting going on, make sure each person contributes. I like to really have people write down their individual responses before coming to the meeting so they prepare and they have their ideas, and then you all share those ideas. You can share it in a Google Doc, or you can share it on the screen, or just like make sure that everyone gets their views out and then try to build on each other's views. 3rd, keep a log of all of the good and bad tasks right now. What are the good assignments and the bad assignments? So bad assignments are those that are like non-promotable. They're not going to help you in your career. And what we find is those are disproportionately given to women and women of color in particular. And we want to make sure that in the same way, leaders are very mindful about who gets good tasks. You know, here's a blue chip client. You want to make sure those are equally distributed, that you are intentional about distributing bad tasks. So you might actually keep a list. And from that list, you make sure that those are being handed out kind of more fairly. Number 4, transparency, transparency, transparency. Even if you don't have all the answers, at least you can talk to your team about what the possibilities are or what decisions are on the table. Because people are going to think the worst in this time. Trust is low. People don't feel as much trust. And I think when you're face to face and someone tells you things are going to be okay, or, you know, we're going to do our best to make sure all of our employees make it through this, when you can look someone in the eyes, you feel like you can trust them. But when someone's on a screen, you don't feel that to the same extent. So you need to convey or build that trust in other ways. And the way to do that is just to be transparent with what's going on, what decisions are being made, and what you're doing about it. And then number 5, I'm going to suggest you hold at least one virtual team social event to build belonging on your team and let people know that, you know, you're still a group. You're supporting each other, you're friends, you guys are a cohesive team. And so whatever that is for your group, I mean, just do one to start with. And if you love it, then you can do more. So again, I'm going to pause here for a second and have you just maybe take a couple notes of intentions, things that you really want to do off this list, or other things that have come to mind that you can get started on. Okay. So I'm just about at the end of my talk here. I want to say that I hope you and your family is safe and well, and I hope that you've enjoyed this United presentation. I think it's a great idea to try to bring people together through learning, and I know for me it really is useful and exciting to learn new things in this time, because I feel like otherwise I'm just like kind of stagnating in the basement. So I thought this was a fantastic idea, and I'm super happy to support this and share some of my work. If you want to know more, I'm going to give you a few resources you can go to here. Again, if you want to know about the ways in which you as a leader might be most likely to utilize uniqueness and belonging, like what are your strengths? Are you really good at belonging? Are you really good at uniqueness? Are you good at both? Are you bad at both? I've created a quiz at inclusifier.com that it's very short, it's painless, it's free, it asks you a few questions, and then it'll give you specific behavioral suggestions that are tailored for your leadership style. You can also learn more about Inclusify at drstephjohnson.com or inclusifybook.com. If you want to stay in contact, please feel free to link in with me or send me a message through my website. And if you want the slides from today, please text. This might be more relevant, more useful for people in the States, but text webinar to this number here, 844-476-9863, and I'll send you the slides. If you're international and you don't want to do international texting, then you can email me and I'll send you the slides as well. Finally, my last little bubble here, I want to talk about this disease threat idea again. And in this time where people are feeling stressed and anxious, in fact, the way we view the world shrinks down to this very narrow space. And so what I want you to try to do is the opposite of that. So rather than letting this drain you and shrink your focus to a tiny view, I hope or I encourage you to continue doing things like this, learning, and that expands your view, being creative, do some art, go outside, enjoy yourself. And thank you for joining me here on this Unite TED Talk.